You've been a long-time member of the Society for Psychical Research. Can you tell me how long you've been involved with the SPR and what offices you have held?
I've been a member of the Society for Psychical Research since the 1940s, but it's only in the last 10 or 12 years that I've been actively involved. And for the last, I suppose, 10 years, I've been acting as either chairman of the Image and Publicity Committee and secretary of the Survival Research Committee. Now, the Survival Research Committee is involved in encouraging research into aspects of the survival of human consciousness after death and into mediumship, which of course is associated with it. The Society for Psychical Research has an extraordinarily notorious reputation for being scientifically rigorous, and many people consider that it goes overboard in its skepticism. But in fact, it has been extremely, over the years, it's been extremely careful to ensure that the material that it produces, by and large, goes through the peer review system and is as scientifically kosher as anything can be. And indeed, because we are dealing with those things which are extraordinary, we consider that extraordinary things do require a much higher level of authenticity than would normally be required for things which are within the scientific paradigm. Indeed, over the years, the SPR has been responsible for exposing quite a number of hoaxes, starting with the rather notorious Hodgson report back in the 1880s into Madame Blavatsky, although his methodology has now been found to be a bit doubtful, but particularly with its investigations into physical mediums. And it was extremely difficult to get anything past the SPR's hierarchy, which appeared to show physical mediumship in a positive light. In more recent years, that has changed somewhat, but the rigour required of scientific investigation is really very high. Physical mediumship is where the medium, instead of merely conveying information orally, manages to be the means by which physical things are produced. Now, the physical things are very often, primitively speaking, table tapping, table raps, knocks and things of that nature. Advancing from that, there are things that move around the place, tables that actually get up and move or pull people around, and then the materialization of phantom forms in some form or other, very often and traditionally through the emanation of something called ectoplasm, which comes from different orifices in the medium's body. And this has been a subject of enormous controversy over the last more than 100 years. From the point of view of investigators, and I'm now looking at it as a Society for Psychical Research investigator, our object was to see whether the reports that we'd had of amazing physical phenomena being produced by this group of mediums in the village of Scole in Norfolk, whether those phenomena could be produced under conditions which positively excluded the possibility of fraud. And so our object initially, and indeed throughout the whole of our investigation, was to see whether, in agreement with the people sitting around the table, the group, and in agreement with the communicators from the other side, who were regarded by them as their mentors and who ruled the roost, as it were, we could agree upon procedures for the production of physical phenomena, particularly physical phenomena related to the production of films. The aims and purpose of the investigators of the Scole group was to discover whether, in conjunction with them and by agreement with them, we could work out a series of protocols, a series of rules for the production of physical phenomena which would positively exclude any possibility of fraud. Initially, we were all pretty sceptical because what had been claimed seemed so way out. What had been claimed primarily was concerned with the production of pictures without cameras, without any form of manipulation by anyone. And this seemed to us to be worthy of investigation with a very critical hat on. Their initial claims were that they were in contact with a group of deceased entities who were producing, with their help, a number of pictures. The pictures which they reproduced were of either deceased persons or were films, strips of films, which they claimed to be produced without any cameras and in the dark. the report into the activities of the Skoll Group was the result of some 2 years' investigation that my colleagues and I did. I wrote the report, which runs to about 250, 300 pages, and it was published by the Society in conjunction with my two principal colleagues, that's Professor Fontana and the late Professor Ellison. And as I say, it was published in 1999. When we started the typical session of Skoll in this darkened cellar, we'd be sitting round a table. The only light at that stage would be small pieces of luminous tape so that we could see who was moving round their wrists. That's the group. There were 6 of them originally, and then it were only 4 because 2 of them left. We would start off with some sort of prayer or incantation to ask for divine blessing, etc. But it wasn't really religious in that sense. And then there would be music. Music was needed to stir the vibe somehow. After the music, it was usually Manu would come through. Manu was the introducer, and then he would disappear. Manu would give us a pep talk, saying what was going to happen in that session and how much he welcomed us and how important it was, etc. And then invariably we would have the main female communicator, indeed the only female communicator, to come through. That was Mrs. Bradshaw, though we got to know her first name and to call her by her first name when we got fairly intimate. And Mrs. Bradshaw, who was a very commanding figure, a lady of the upper class Victorian or Edwardian lady, or she sounded like that, and she would organise things and she would introduce other entities, male entities. She would tell us what was going to happen. She would comment on what we were doing and why we would be doing it, and indeed how we were behaving, and sometimes what we were thinking. She would answer our questions quite frequently before we had actually asked them, which was quite embarrassing sometimes. I must say my most surprising incident in, I think, the first or second seance that I had was when, because at that stage we weren't at all sure that we would get reports available to us, transcripts available to us, which we thought was absolutely essential. I was making a note of everything in shorthand, which is pretty difficult to do in the dark, under the table. I mean, with their knowledge. The communications were coming through almost exclusively through one or other of the 2 mediums, husband and wife, both of them, as far as we knew, in total trance, and they were unconscious of what was happening. At a later stage, we did have some direct voice, that's to say, voices which appeared to be coming from right in front of us and which were not using the larynxes of the 2 mediums. However, this is something which was certainly our very strong impression, but we couldn't prove it one way or the other, so we tended to rather disregard these distinctions. When the voices came through the mediums, which they normally did, the voices were quite different from those of the mediums themselves, and the personalities behind the voices were not only quite different, but were very consistent. Even the accents were. And we began to recognise, it was very easy to recognise the female one because there was only one, and she was very, very idiosyncratic. The ones coming through the male medium, there were several different ones. They all had distinctive voices, although I found it more difficult than some of my colleagues did to determine who was who. But there were several of them over the period of the year, and some of them had specialities. There was one very obvious one, Raji, who was described himself as a mad, dead Indian, and who would make jokes and had a very characteristic, rather schoolboy sense of humour. And he would have an interchange with the female medium, with the female communicator, Mrs. Bradshaw. Mrs. Bradshaw was really the woman in charge. She was the sort of major domo-ess, as it were, ushering people in and out and telling us who was going to come and who wasn't going to come. We don't exactly know, because it's all in the dark, exactly when the mediums do go into trance. In fact, we had no means of proving that they were in trance. But all the indications are that unless they were lying, they were in trance. And they went into trance apparently quite quickly. We heard some deep breathings and some slight sort of moans, and that would be it. They would go into trance just like that. It's a question of training, apparently. And they would gradually come out of trance at the end of the session, and it was rather important that they should do so slowly, because if we switched on the lights suddenly, that would harm them. The leading character was undoubtedly Emily Bradshaw. She, I suppose, was sort of 60% of what came through, but there were others with various names. They only had their first names. We never discovered who they were supposed to be in reality. But there was Joseph, for example, who was a rather grave ex-scientist. We didn't really... There was Raji, who was a mad, dead Indian, I say, and who really contributed to the joyousness of the affair, because it was quite a jolly affair. There was an ex-Irishman who spoke in a distinctive Northern Irish accent. I think he described himself as a former priest. And there were one or two others who played more or less important part as different experiments were conducted. And when we had experiments which required expertise in a particular area, photographic area or area of reproduction and so on, apparently there were different experts available. But they weren't always directly available. They sometimes had to come through another entity on the other side and then through the mediums. So there was scope for misunderstanding and misrepresentation. The sessions were all recorded on audio, and we got transcripts of all of those that we participated in. And these transcripts were pretty lengthy, but they were an important part of our investigation procedure, because we didn't want to rely upon our memory. The most spectacular aspect, which virtually all of the people who attended these Skoll sittings have reported with amazement, were, I suppose, the lights. They would come on fairly quickly. The lights appeared to be animated in the sense that they were intelligently directed and intelligently moving, and would be responsive to our wishes, whether expressed or silent. They would, the lights would be mainly orbs that would move around with incredible speed, sometimes performing all sorts of gyrations in the air, but able to somehow or other be solid enough to make noises when they hit the top of the table, or you could feel them when they landed on our fingers. On one occasion, one of my colleagues, Professor Grattan Guinness, without permission, had the light sitting on his hand and enclosed it. And having enclosed it, he turned his hand over in order to ensure there were no sort of connecting rods or links or wires. And it buzzed around angrily inside his cupped hands, and then when he released it, it disappeared. He got ticked off for this, not because it was wrong to do it, but because he hadn't asked permission. But it did indicate to him, to his satisfaction, and indeed I think to everybody else's, there was nothing physical that could have explained the movement of these very animated and intelligent little lights. We were never sure exactly what the lights were, except, because obviously we asked questions about it, except that they were animated spirits, but they weren't, as it were, fully formed. They weren't discarnate entities as we understand them. They were somewhere in between, but they were certainly animated, and they were certainly responsive to our wishes. I suppose the example of the lights which was most dramatic for me, and indeed for my colleagues who participated in it, it was a definite experiment. A light appeared and settled on one of the 4 pieces of crystal, about 4 inches long, and it irradiated the crystal, which was sitting right in front of me. The crystal then levitated in front of our eyes. We could see it glowing, and then descended into a Pyrex semi-translucent bowl, such that we could see the light glowing inside the bowl and the piece of crystal there. Then Arthur Ellison, sitting on my right, was invited to pick it up. He picked it up and satisfied himself that it was there and it was glowing, and he put it down again. He was asked right away to pick it up again. He picked it up, or he tried to, and his fingers closed right over it. In other words, he could see, and we could see, the essence of it, but not the reality of it. It had dematerialized. Then he was asked to pick it up again, and it rematerialized in his hand. Now, this dumbfounded him. This is what Arthur Ellison, after years and years of investigation, finally convinced him that this was real, because it couldn't have been faked in any way. And he had his head right over the top of the bowl in order to ensure that no hand or no instrument could interfere with it. Then the experiment was repeated because I wanted to do the same thing. I could hardly believe it. And exactly the same thing happened with me. And then on my left was David Fontana, and Professor Fontana insisted on having his go too, and it was repeated a second time. So that was, I suppose, the most dramatic aspect of the lights, as far as I was concerned, and also a pretty conclusive piece of evidence that something very paranormal was happening. Now, an apport, which we had some experience of, but not all that many, is something which materializes out of nothing. The most amusing one was where we had a bet with the entity that an experiment would fail. She said it would win, the experiment would work, and she bet us £0.50, an old-fashioned coin, that it would work. It didn't work, and we teased her about it. And the next session started with Manu saying, "Hold on a moment, we've got something for you." There was a big clang, which shouldn't have taken place because it was later found on the floor, which was carpeted, and we subsequently found a £0.50 as payment for her debt. And she said triumphantly, as this coin rattled to the ground, we couldn't see it, "Debt paid." That was an apport, and I've still got it here. It was amusing, but it was also quite significant. Of course, it could have been faked, because we don't attribute too much to that. But if you take all of these things together, the possibility of faking becomes steadily less and less possible. If you take all the phenomena within the whole of the Scole experiment over 2 years while we were there, I would say that the possibility of fraud and faking was nil. But if you take each individual particular phenomena and examine the circumstances under which each phenomenon was produced, you could perhaps argue that there's a gap here, a hole here, something which wasn't absolutely 100%. But taken all together, I think that there's no doubt that they were genuine. Before we arrived, and one of the things that we were shown to convince us was a copy of a newspaper which was the Daily Mail of the 1st of April 1944, and it contained an article about the sentencing to 18 months imprisonment of a famous, or rather infamous, medium called Helen Duncan. And it was explained to us that this was in order that Helen Duncan, who was watching from the other side the proceedings, was going to give some indication of her presence. And then, lo and behold, this fairly pristine copy of the paper arrived. Well, we didn't regard this too evidentially, but because it was challenged later on by one of my colleagues, who said, look, it's quite possible to produce these things from reproductions, we took it to the leading research station in England, indeed in the world, on paper and printing, in order to have it analysed. And it was absolutely clear from their report, indeed I was there when they showed it to me, that first of all it was done on letterpress, which has gone out of existence virtually since the early 1970s, I would say. And also the quality of the paper was identical to the quality of the paper produced in the same year. It was newsprint produced during wartime, which lacked certain chemicals which you couldn't get hold of. So this was a genuine article which appeared 50 years after the event on their doorstep, and no one has been able to explain how it got there. While I can't swear exactly what happened to Rupert, because from his point of view, this was a unique experience. By that time I had become a little blasé. But there were frequent occasions when there were materializations of spirit forms with sufficient amount of light, the light being generated by all these orbs around, to enable us to see the outline of them. They looked like and were described as angelic forms. They certainly had some sort of physical substance, because quite frequently they would sweep against us as though a piece of gossamer or cotton wool or cobwebs had touched us. It was quite physical in that sense. And then they would disappear, but sometimes they would last sufficiently long for us to see them change shape and move around. But they were not at all in the same category as the traditional materializations of forms which came from ectoplasm and which would build up and walk around the place. That we didn't have. There was no ectoplasm involved, and indeed the energy involved in this appeared to be quite different from the traditional type of energy which produces physical energy, physical ectoplasm. The forms did vary quite a lot. They were shadowy, not substantial, but able to, you could actually feel them, or they could feel you, and they would float around. You could almost see through them. On occasions, a hand would materialize. I mean, I'm thinking of one occasion when a hand grasped me and, as it were, stroked my left hand. The hand was sufficiently visible in the light for me to see the fingernails. The hand was quite warm and natural. I wanted to ensure that, of course, it wasn't a hand that had been produced artificially or someone was stretching over the table. It was in such a position that it couldn't have been produced from any normal source. I was told who the hand belonged to, actually. It was a well-known dematerialized entity on the other side who appeared to be one of the spirits underlying the investigations and supporting it. But the reasons for that are really quite involved, and we go into some details about that in our report. But the hand itself was caressing me for a time. It was a male hand, and it lasted for at least 2 to 3 minutes. And I found it, far from being spooky, a rather wonderful experience. And I'm a very cerebral and rather unemotional sort of bloke, but this I found quite impressive. This hand wasn't insubstantial, it was quite physical, and I could see it, and I couldn't see through it. It looked like a normal hand. But when I asked about the hand appeared to be not connected to any body, Emily said rather tartly, "We don't deal in bits of bodies." But apparently they do deal in bits of bodies, because there was no other body around, and there wouldn't have been physically room for it, because it was on the table. So the mystery of the hand remained. I can't speak for the Solomon's book, because they were talking about what the Skull group told them, what happened both before and during our investigations. I naturally tended to concentrate upon what we experienced ourselves, and to largely disregard as anecdotal, with all respect to the Skull group, what they experienced. But of course we had to take into account the testimony of a large number of people who had attended their sessions and who were eager to give us their authentication of what happened, and this helps to build up. For example, we had someone who had been there on 3 occasions and who was a former member of the Magic Circle, as a professional conjurer, an illusionist, who was there specifically in order to see whether this could be faked in any way, and he was absolutely satisfied that it couldn't be. Now, that sort of evidence, although it was before we came on the scene, seemed to us to augment our own impressions of genuineness. While I can't swear exactly what happened to Rupert, because from his point of view this was a unique experience. By that time I had become a little blasé. But there were frequent occasions when there were materializations of spirit forms with sufficient amount of light, the light being generated by all these orbs around, to enable us to see the outline of them. They looked like and were described as angelic forms. they certainly had some sort of physical substance, because quite frequently they would sweep against us as though a piece of gossamer or cotton wool or cobwebs had touched us. It was quite physical in that sense. And then they would disappear, but sometimes they would last sufficiently long for us to see them change shape and move around. But they were not at all in the same category as the traditional materializations of forms which came from ectoplasm and which would build up and walk around the place. That we didn't have. There was no ectoplasm involved, and indeed the energy involved in this appeared to be quite different from the traditional type of energy which produces physical energy, physical ectoplasm. Well, the forms did vary quite a lot. They were shadowy, not substantial, but able to, you could actually feel them, or they could feel you. And they would float around. You could almost see through them. On occasions, a hand would materialize. I mean, I'm thinking of one occasion when a hand grasped me and, as it were, stroked my left hand. The hand was sufficiently visible in the light for me to see the fingernails. The hand was quite warm and natural. I wanted to ensure that, of course, it wasn't a hand that had been produced artificially or someone was stretching over the table. It was in such a position that it couldn't have been produced from any normal source. I was told who the hand belonged to, actually. It was a well-known dematerialized entity on the other side who appeared to be one of the spirits underlying the investigations and supporting it. But the reasons for that are really quite involved, and we go into some details about that in our report. But the hand itself was caressing me for a time. It was a male hand, and it lasted for at least 2 to 3 minutes. And I found it, far from being spooky, a rather wonderful experience. And I'm a very cerebral and rather unemotional sort of bloke, but this I found quite impressive. This hand wasn't insubstantial, it was quite physical, and I could see it, and I couldn't see through it. It looked like a normal hand. But when I asked about the hand appeared to be not connected to any body, Emily said rather tartly, "We don't deal in bits of bodies." But apparently they do deal in bits of bodies, because there was no other body around, and there wouldn't have been physically room for it because it was on the table. So the mystery of the hand remained. Our main object was to produce these films under conditions which eliminated any possibility of hoaxing. So we would buy the film ourselves. We would load it either into a box or into a container, a security bag, depending on how we proceeded, the protocol changing rather from experiment to experiment. And then immediately afterwards, if it was, as it usually was, Polaroid film, we would take it out of the box or the bag ourselves so that no one else touched it, and then develop it ourselves in a special machine. And we could see then what the strips of films contained. On the assumption that they were able, or someone was able, to get hold of a sealed box and somehow or other manipulate it so that you could take out the film and put in another film which has already been prepared, and then seal the box again, all in the dark and without our knowledge and without hearing anything peculiar and so on. We found this hypothesis extremely improbable, and it presupposed an ability to manipulate a sealed box which had been padlocked in the dark, by people who we were watching all the time and who had identification labels on their wrists. So I wouldn't say it was impossible. Nothing's absolutely impossible, but extraordinarily unlikely that this could have been done. But in other cases, there was no possibility because it was held in our hands all the time. We think there was no possibility in those cases where the box, a little tub containing the film, was put in a box. The box was held in the hands of the experimenter so that no one could get at it, no substitution was possible. And then the experimenter would take it away and develop it himself in front of other people in the special gadget which Polaroid had provided for developing 35mm films. That we thought was as foolproof as anything could be. It became quite clear that there was a learning curve on the part of the Spirit team, as there was on our part, because it was an interchange, groping forward to see what they could do, because they couldn't do everything we wanted. They wouldn't do it in the light, for example. They wouldn't have infrared. So we had to devise a protocol which would satisfy them, but also satisfy us. But there was definitely a learning curve. We persistently asked them to accept infrared cameras, and they said, not yet, we're not ready for it. It would interfere with the vibes, with the energy in some way. From our point of view, we could see no way in which this was likely or could be done. But then again, we don't understand how their method of communication or how their energy works. So we had to accept this with great reluctance. They made, as far as I can recall, no effort to explain in technical terms why that was the case. But on other occasions, they were able to discuss highly technical matters with us, which seemed to indicate a familiarity with technical matters which were sometimes quite beyond my competence. The film that we saw had a little diagram on showing how the germanium gadget, as we called it, should be modified in such a way by the introduction of two coils and where the coils were to go, with a little description in writing as to why it was going to enhance reception, and a little squiggle at the end, which we disregarded at the time. But then it occurred to us that this must be an initial. We were told to look at it for that purpose. And then I wrote to the Edison Memorial people in America, and they sent me a copy of one of his letters, which contained his initials, which looked almost identical to the signature on this film. Well, Arthur Ellison, then, having been given these instructions by none other than Edison, duly altered made these modifications. The modifications were introduced, but they didn't work very well. I mean, they improved the reception slightly. The idea was to get a communication on a tape in a recorder which had no microphone in it, so that this would be a clear indication of their communication from us to us. But by the time they were playing around with this and were practicing it, they wanted to go on to a different experiment. And this was indeed one of our problems, that instead of really completing something and trying it again and again until they got it absolutely perfect, it seemed as though there were a whole host of entities on the other side who were muscling in and eager to try it was their turn, thank you very much, because presumably it was pretty rare to have some group of people like this who were willing and able to be the instrument of producing these physical phenomena. So that was one of our frustrations. They wanted to move on to some new experiment before we were absolutely sure that we were 100% there. The germanium device was originally constructed because the entities asked Arthur Ellison and gave him very detailed instructions about how to do it, whether he could A, get a piece of germanium, and secondly, put it, and then they described in some detail how it was to be constructed, to be put under some sort of pressure, and they described what the pressure should be, and what the voltage should be, and how the coil was going to work, and all that sort of thing. It was meaningless to me. It meant something to Arthur Ellison, and it was virtually a type of primitive semiconductor, the sort of thing that preceded the development of silicon chips, which is one of the reasons why Arthur Ellison was rather sniffy about it, because he didn't think it was very modern. But this is what they wanted, so he constructed the with the help of the Skoll group. He supervised the construction of this little germanium gadget, as we called it. For me, perhaps the most significant type of communication, because it was directed personally at and to me as a sort of thank you for work that I'd done on another aspect of the puzzles that they had set us, was on the last occasion we had a full sitting with them. This was where we had a blank tape in a tape recorder from which the microphone had been removed. And at a particular moment, we started the tape recorder. We could we could handle it. We could see where the starting and stopping was. And at that time, the whole thing was also being recorded on a normal tape recorder. So that at the end, we had 2 tapes for half an hour, one recording everything that we heard, and the other was the tape where nothing at all should have come through and nothing at all ought to have been recorded. But in fact, there was a recording what I was told would be of significance to me. And it turned out that I soon recognized a piece of music which was very significant for me because it was the first bit of classical music that I ever really knew well, and it had great emotional content. It was, in fact, the second movement of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, and it can be readily heard coming through. We heard it all coming through this machine, which had a tape on, which had no normal means of recording anything. And above this, there was a voice-over. The voice-over was giving some sort of pontifical message which we couldn't quite understand, but it was clearly in English, and it sounded as though it was coming from the back of the stage of a Victorian melodramatic orator. But the important thing for me was the music that was a complete recording, very similar to that which I had been brought up on, where Rachmaninoff actually played his own piano concerto. And the whole of the orchestra was there on this tape. And obviously we asked about it, and they said, well, this is just a thought projection coming from us, as a thank you to me for having congratulated them on one of the earlier experiments, the so-called Wordsworth experiment. I think the most memorable one, from my point of view, was where we had a tape recorder from which the microphone had been removed, and in which we put in a blank tape. And apparently as a present to me for my hard work, they said that they were going to bring something which was going to be, a music. And the music, I soon recognized, coming out of this machine, which was being held actually by my colleague David Fontana in his hand, having pressed the 2 buttons, record and play, which shouldn't have recorded anything at all, but it was recording Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, which had a lot of resonance for me. And there was a voice-over on top of it, which one could hear coming through. And this lasted for about 10 minutes or so, and then faded out. There was a lot of white noise too, but it was a very good example of something which shouldn't have been there at all. We didn't actually know when we'd set up the experiment what we were going to hear, but they said before we actually started pressing the buttons and recording whatever was supposed to be coming through, that they were going to do a gift for me, something to say thank you for my hard work. And it was going to be in the form of music, and there was a certain amount of badinage about why I should be given a gift when others didn't, and all that sort of thing. And then we began to hear music coming through the tape recorder with no microphone in it, which was being held by one of my colleagues on my immediate left. And the tape recording was of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, which was very meaningful to me. And above this, there was a voice-over that we couldn't quite recognize, but it was at the same time as the whole of this orchestral music was being played. I wasn't myself present when a film with the German poem came up, but the person who was were 2 close cooperators of ours, Walter Schnittger and his wife. And Walter Schnittger, obviously German, produced this, well, he had the film in a box. The box was sealed, and he subsequently opened it, produced the film with the German message on. The German message was a poem that no one has yet been able to trace. We originally thought it was written by a man called Rupert, who wrote in the 19th century. It was sort of written in the style of the 1840s, 1850s, Sturm und Drang sort of style, but the actual poem itself was handwritten in a style which was more typical of the way in which the Germans wrote German in the 1920s. So there was a puzzle there, but the poem was regarded by Germans as being very good quality. And we made terrific efforts to find out whether it had ever been published, whether anyone would recognise it. We wrote to all the German professors in virtually all the universities in the country, and also went to Germany for this purpose as well, but no one was able to trace who wrote it or where it came from. Why do the spirits choose to communicate in this particular cryptic manner? And I wish I knew the answer. It could be that they want to pose difficult problems for us, because the more difficult the problem and the more difficult it is to discover the solution to it, the more evidential it appears to be. If it's obvious, if, for example, someone like Napoleon came through and said, yeah, I can prove I was Napoleon, I was married to Josephine, well, everybody knows that. If, on the other hand, some highly obscure person comes through, and that has happened, and they say who they are, and there's absolutely no trace of them, it's not evidential. So you've got to find some way in which, if they want to prove afterlife, and that's the assumption that we go on, if they want to prove afterlife, they must find some way in which they can overcome this dilemma by providing information which is not easy to get at, which is not readily available in the public domain, which shows some sign of intelligence and which is related to them in some way. Now, I don't think that that particular poem quite fits that bill. It was certainly arcane and certainly very specialised and very intelligent, and it did show that someone or other could provide what was regarded as a very well-written poem in German, which went way beyond any possible competence on the part of the Skoll group, if they had been able to fake it. We often asked ourselves why they chose this particular cryptic form of conveying information, and we really don't know the answer. I suppose it is because if they wanted to provide, say, evidence that a particular individual, Napoleon, was coming through, and we wanted to get him to authenticate this, and he said, well, I was married to Josephine. Well, everybody knows that, and he can't tell us anything that isn't in the public domain, so it's not evidential. If, on the other hand, it's someone highly obscure, and no one's ever heard of him, or we can't even trace him, well, that's equally non-evidential. So in a way, the motivation for providing something which is a puzzle, which is difficult to solve, is simply because it is difficult to solve. It isn't readily available. It can't be easily attributable to the person sitting around the table in that seance room. I think it could be argued that there was nothing which absolutely proved the afterlife as distinct from something that's emanating from the consciousness or the unconsciousness of the mediums. We were constantly on the lookout for clues, for things which went well beyond what the mediums were able to do or were likely to be able to do. And there were, I suppose, something like 15 or 20 such indications of things which we thought were extremely unlikely. We couldn't prove that they were impossible, but they would have presupposed a very considerable degree of information and knowledge on the part of the medium, which we thought was unlikely. For example, they provided information of a rather specialist nature about identifying and commenting on some of the music which was being played on background tapes. And we thought it very unlikely that any of the Skoll group, or particularly the medium himself, who was not particularly interested in music and knew very little about it, would be able to know. For example, we had, as a bit of background music, one of the commentators said in relation to the background music, it was I should say it was a tape recording of bits and pieces of classical music, in which 2 or 3 bars of classical music melded into another 2 or 3 bars, you know. I disapproved of it rather, but the entity on the other side was commenting on it. And then he made a comment on something which was reversed and going backwards and forwards, or going back from the middle and then you get back to the middle. Something which didn't seem to me to make, didn't seem to anyone to make any sense. And then I realized that what he was talking about was the particular variation of the Rachmaninoff Paganini variations, which is an inversion. Now, not a lot of people know that the inversion is number 18 in the variations. This is a very specialised bit of knowledge. I happen to know it because I'm interested in this sort of thing, but I'm pretty sure that the medium himself didn't know that. But it was coming from the other side, almost spontaneously. It wasn't something that sort of he was priding himself on knowing a lot about the bits of music. He was trying to identify each fragment of music. It was a sort of game, as it were. So that's an example of the sort of thing I mean when I say we were looking for things all the time which couldn't be reasonably attributed to the mediums themselves. But taken in isolation, you can't say any one of these is proof of anything. The criticism that you don't get very much information which makes it clear what it's like to be in the afterlife is one that's always made, and I think it's always justified. The people on the other side say, look, we live in a totally different world in which we have none of the normal senses. We are just minds, and this is something, and also time doesn't mean anything. But you down here, you earthlings, can't understand this because you don't have the vocabulary, you don't have the conception to understand it because your world is limited by your 3 dimensions. Now, I think that is probably true. It's very irritating, but it's probably true that we can't understand what it's like to be in a world without time, for example. So inevitably, the impression that we get are pretty vague and rather general as to what life is like there. But you see, we were not primarily concerned at that stage to deal with these so-called ontological problems about the nature of afterlife. We were primarily there to get valid information, valid phenomena, which was fraud-free. And then we were going to go on to the more important philosophical questions. We never got to that stage. As far as I know, the photographic material that was produced, strictly speaking, it's not photographic because no cameras were involved, but the films produced were unique. I don't know of any other experiment where this sort of thing has happened. There have been plenty of cases where photography has taken place, where someone's mind has been projected and you get a film, a single film. But strips of film made in these circumstances, in the sort of conditions that we had at school, no, there's been nothing quite like that. The assumption or theory is that these pictures were created by a thought process, but the mechanism of it being created on this film is totally unknown. The only alternative explanation is they are all fakes, and I don't believe that there's evidence that that is the case. I think that those pictures can be explained only by imagining that the spirits can project their recollections and images onto a film in some way we can't begin to understand. I can see no other explanation, and I don't understand what that explanation is, of course. The way in which they actually transmit a sound onto a magnetic tape is something which we asked them about and on which we had some explanation. The explanation which is recorded in the Skull report is pretty technical, and I'm not at all sure that I understood it. It was given actually to one of my colleagues while I was conducting an experiment. And it talks about non-spin energy, for example, whatever that is. I mean, it's something that I think physics doesn't at the moment understand. And how in getting to the tape, there's a problem of a cut-off point. Now, there's a cut-off point associated with the use of silicon chips. It's a cut-off, which means that the silicon chips fail to operate beyond a certain temperature. And they identified this as a problem, and they said that the problem, and they told us how the problem would eventually be solved by something called, I think, silicon oxide. Or at any rate, they gave us the name of a chemical which they thought was likely to be the way in which this problem, which limits the use of semiconductors in all sorts of circumstances, will eventually be solved. In other words, there were technical discussions of a level which went way beyond anything that was likely to be attributable to the medium himself or to his subconscious. When we were having experiments in Ibiza on the tape recordings, Walter Schnittke, who was a technician, was asking questions of the spirits about the mechanism by which they got information on the tape. And I was astonished at the degree of technical detail that followed in the exchanges, detail far beyond anything likely to be reasonably attributable to the male medium who was speaking. It seems that from what we were told, that the individual entities coming through were either specialists or were acting on behalf of specialists. Sometimes when we questioned them, they said they didn't know, but they'd have to find out. So the answer, I think, is that there were specialists on the other side, and it would be very difficult to explain the variety of things that came through unless there were specialists.
So in other words, there was a concerted effort by these spiritual entities to facilitate a bridge between the worlds.
I think it's pretty clear that there was a deliberate and a communal effort on the part of the spirit entities to prove survival and to cooperate in proving survival by a variety of different means and using their different specialities to do so. I think the impression that we got from the entirety of our experience was there was a group on the other side, including or with available information from specialists whose anxiety was to find different ways in which they could prove the existence of the afterlife and their ability to communicate intelligently with us. We invited quite a range of different scientists from different disciplines because I wanted to give credibility to the whole of the experiment. What happened was that not all of them, of course, experienced the same thing, and not all of them were equally credulous, and some were more or less critical. But, for example, Grattan Guinness, who was a professor of mathematics, was not only so impressed, but he came to a public meeting and demonstrated how he had actually encapsulated the spirit of this orb in order to ensure that there could be no possible fraud. The two principal investigators, apart from myself, were two very highly qualified scientists. One was Arthur Ellison, who was an emeritus professor of electrical engineering, who'd been involved in this type of thing for many years, and Professor David Fontana, who's a professor of psychology. And they not only co-wrote the report with me, but attended most of the sittings that I attended. So there were three of us, all fairly experienced, there, primarily in order to check against any possibility of fraud. But in addition, we did invite a number of other scientists to experience it too. One of them was Dr. Sheldrake, another was Professor Grattan Guinness, another was the present president of the Society for Psychical Research, who came on two different occasions. And there were Professor Archie Roy also attended. He's a professor of astronomy. So we had a range of expertise on our side to match the expertise on their side. And in some cases they could use, as Archie Roy did, his specialist knowledge of a particular area of astronomy in order to have an intelligent exchange about astronomical issues with the other side. I think historically speaking, if you take the whole of the phenomena in the skull group, it ranks among the most profound pieces of evidence for the existence of an afterlife. I don't know what happens when we die, but I'm quite convinced from all my experience, including the experience of the skull experiment, that a consciousness survives, an intelligence survives in some form or other, and that what survives is mind and not anything else, but that mind can create its own environment, so that you do have people on the other side who can smoke cigars and listen to music and play games and walk through, because all of this is of their own creation. That's something which we find extremely difficult to envisage. But I'm quite sure that that's the sort of home that awaits us. What I'm not at all clear about is the relationship between the individual when he dies and the group consciousness of which he appears also to be a part. I think that at some stage or other our entities merge into a group consciousness on the other side. What happens to it then as it goes off into the light, I simply don't know, nor does anyone else. I think the skeptics regard the possibility of the survival of human consciousness as inherently so impossible that anyone must be rather crazy to believe it. But when you look at the evidence, you have to ask yourself whether you'd be even more crazy not to believe it, or to find some alternative explanation which makes any sort of sense, and I haven't found one. I think it's apparent, though you can't prove it, that the progress that a person makes, I don't mean intellectual progress, I mean spiritual progress, whatever that means, in his life here, determines the point of departure, as it were, in the next world. It may be that he's not even ready to go there and he hangs around here and turns into a poltergeist or a ghost and can't be moved on. Or he's got some unfinished business here which prevents him from moving up the ladder, as it were. But all the indications are, and all the evidence from the other side, for what it is worth, is that there is a hierarchical structure, and that the idea is that the person, by self-improvement in some way, with help, moves up to a higher spiritual plane. It's not something I may say I look forward to, but this is what I conclude from the evidence that's available. Well, I don't particularly want to have anything other than pure death. Thank you very much. I rather enjoy living here. I cannot envisage really what it's like to be on the other side, and I would rather not believe in survival, but I find it impossible to be intellectually honest and not believe in survival. I mean, whatever we're going to see and experience is something that we can't quite understand or accept now, and there's so many question marks about it that the easier thing to do is to say, well, I don't want to be involved in it, count me out. When I'm dead, thank you very much, that's it. But I don't believe that to be true. I mean, I think that's just a way of running away from the facts. I'm sure that belief in the afterlife ought to have changed the way I live my life, make me a better person. I'm not aware that it has done, actually, but theoretically, at any rate, I'm quite sure that it helps a lot of other people. And it may even help me when I get to old age, which is any day now. One of the odd things about survival experiments and survival information is the almost universal agreement that there is an immediate review of your whole life when you die, and that there's no crime and punishment of the hell and damnation sort, but it's a process of self-revelation, self-education. How that is done and exactly what happens to the individual during this process is, to my mind, a big question mark. Whether he's reincarnated in order to learn more and then goes back again, I don't know. The evidence for reincarnation, I think, is very profound indeed. I think that if we look for consensus on the other side, we are presupposing something which I believe to be false. And that is that once you get to the other side, you're immediately available for all information, all the mysteries of the world are suddenly revealed to you. And I think that it was Myers who said it's as silly to imagine that once we get to the other side, all mysteries are revealed and all knowledge is available to us, as it is to imagine that a small baby born on your world is immediately possessed of an understanding of how the world works. So there is a hierarchy on the other side of people who've just moved over, who just have no more knowledge of what they're about as they had when they were on this side, and are beginning to learn. And then they move on to higher levels of spirituality where they can intelligently answer a lot of the questions that we pose. But maybe they can't answer those questions in a form which is immediately accessible to us, understandable to us. The fear of death is undoubtedly a profound phenomenon among virtually all people. And I think that once a person is persuaded of the evidence in whatever way that there is an afterlife and that consciousness continues, and they can possibly communicate with their deceased ones on this side, the fear of death begins to evaporate. And it may diminish completely. And if that is the case, then it's a complete justification for all the efforts made by people like me for investigating the evidence. I certainly think it can be argued that eliminating or reducing the fear of death by being persuaded that there is an afterlife does or can change people in all sorts of ways. I don't think it's changed me particularly, at least I'm not conscious of it, but by reducing the fear of death and knowing that they can possibly live again or that there's something afterwards, they should become rather less concerned with material problems and more concerned with living a decent life. How do I know that the spirit voices really did come from the afterlife rather than from the mediums themselves? We don't know that. We simply have a number of clues of information which was extremely unlikely to have derived from the subconscious mind or the conscious mind of the medium. And the more impressive those are, the less likely it is that you can say that this is an aspect of mediumship. And the more likely it is, it's an aspect of discarnate communication.